I want to take a moment to talk about our sponsor, Alt21, the foreign exchange and hedging platform that saves you time and money on cross-border transactions. As a CEO, there are days when my calendar feels like a never-ending cascade of decisions, meetings, and problems to solve. Days when I can't remember if I've eaten lunch. The last thing I have time to think about is currency exposure. This is where Alt21 can help by taking the complexity out of foreign exchange. With their FX and hedging platform, you can lock in exchange rates and automate payments. And with their low fees, up to 90% less than competitors, you'll save money while freeing up your time for what really matters. If you want to stop juggling and start focusing on growing your business, head to alt21.com. That's alt21.com to find out more. Hello and welcome to Enter the Boardroom with Newroll. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Newroll, the board search specialist and market leader, bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today's guest, Cindy Rampersaud, is non-executive director at Sage Homes, England's largest provider of newly built affordable housing, backed by Blackstone and Regis, deputy chair and chair of audit and risk at the UK Health Security Agency, and board member at Which, a consumer association body. Formerly, she was senior independent director and audit chair at Hipgnosis Songs Fund Ltd, board member of UK ASEAN Business Council, and trustee at Victim Support, the Children's Society, Speakers Trust, and London Film School. Cindy, a huge welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Ollie. I'm looking forward to our discussion over the next hour or so.
You started your journey into the boardroom in 2010 when you joined the board of the Children's Society and then subsequently Victim Support. In episode 106, Tamara Box spoke about the importance of figuring out what her things were as a non-executive director, and she related the story of being invited to sit on the board of a prestigious animal charity which she was about to accept when her husband challenged her on whether that was really her thing. How have you decided which pro bono roles to take on?
What Tamara says resonates first and foremost. It has to be about organisations that I feel passionate about, that I have an understanding of, that I feel empathy towards who their beneficiaries are. The key strand has been around young people and the voice of young people and empowering them. They are our next generation after all. So I think that's been the key strand. And the Children's Society, interestingly enough, was the first trustee role. But prior to that, I'd been on the board of a large inner city college. I gained some really good insights and understanding of that particular group, young people, and some of the challenges they faced. So when the Children's Society opportunity came up, which actually came up as a result of somebody saying, you ought to look at this, they're looking for board members, it felt like a really good fit. But like Tamara, I've also had the experience of being called up about, it was an audit and risk role for a sports governing body. And it was incredibly flattering because it was linked to the kind of Olympic committee, but I knew nothing about the sport. And so actually, in reality, I probably wasn't going to be able to get excited about it, be as vested in it as I probably needed to be if it's a charitable board.
I think lots of listeners will be thinking about where do they allocate their time in the pro bono space. Be interested to hear what you personally have got from doing those roles that those listening might learn from.
I've been doing pro bono roles since 2008, which is a very long time actually on reflection. When I look back on it, I think the key things for me were, and I mentor a number of people and it's what I share about my own experiences, is firstly and foremost, it gives you an opportunity to learn about governance and board governance and understand the other side if you're an exec or a leader. It gives you some real perspective and actually thinking about how you bring the outside in. Most leaders are incredibly busy. Trying to create some space to think is difficult. And I think actually sometimes being on a board creates really good space and an opportunity to learn. And the other thing for me has been about how I could join and connect organisations. So if I think about the Speakers Trust and about the Children's Society, there was a lot of what they were doing that overlapped with my time at Pearson and the audience that we were working with and dealing with. So thinking about how you can cross-connect organisations as well. But I think it's a brilliant opportunity to develop, but also create some space and create some networks. And had I not done board roles throughout or trustee roles throughout, I probably wouldn't have then thought about this next phase of my career, which is building out a plural career. I really try to encourage people in leadership roles to think about taking on a role. And a charitable role is a great one as a first step to really understand governance and the working of governance.
The connection piece is interesting because again, will often encourage people to think about that. And we've had Professor Isabel Fernandez Mateo in the past talking about the importance of your weak ties, whereas most people tend to think it's your strong ties in your network that add most value to you. How do you go about building those ties on those boards? Is it literally the other people on the board? Is it the broader organization? Or is it even broader than that, the discussions that you're having as part of that broader organization?
I think it's building out a network with different people that you may not meet in your everyday work life, and an ability, I think, to learn from them and learn from the sectors that they might be in. It's a real opportunity to think about some of the experiences that those organizations might be going through and how they're working with their stakeholders, how they're working with their customers, how they're using digital, and how you might apply that to your own business. So if I give you a particular example of connectivity, if I think about the Speakers Trust is an amazing organization that reaches, I think, 25,000 children a year and helping to empower them to stand up and do a public speech on any topic. And for me, the connectivity was really rich material in terms of understanding what young people were thinking, what their concerns were, what some of the challenges were. The flip side is the Children's Society do this amazing report every year called the Good Childhood Report. Actually, the insights from Speakers Trust are very relevant for the Children's Society. So it's how you think about connecting those two organizations. And likewise, Pearson reaches all schools in the country. So connecting an organization like Speakers Trust into Pearson, I think quite useful, particularly during COVID, and thinking about how they use digital to reach young people in quite a difficult environment. So it's learning, but also thinking laterally about how those organizations could learn from each other and where there might be a more clear connection in terms of benefiting their business model or their impact or reach.
Yeah, it reminds me of some of my own experiences where what struck me is, I was involved in the board of an education institution for a long time, and the nature of that allows you to connect with people in a different way because everyone is interested in education. You're passionate about it. And so it allows you to build bonds at a different level. And then at the same time, one of the really sort of penny drop moments for me on that board was seeing how they engaged and motivated people. And I'd sort of come in with my private equity mindset, saying, well, we've got to have bonus plans and incentive schemes and share plans and the like. And then realizing actually they're getting the level of engagement they're getting from their team and level of buy-in exceeds anything I've ever seen before. And they're not doing it using incentive schemes and bonus plans. And that just forcing me to reflect on actually maybe there's a different and a better way of doing this.
I guess there's also a challenge there in that if you join a charity board, it's understanding some of those differences, especially if you're from the commercial sector, as I am predominantly. And I think it's interesting that you talk about profit and incentives, because of course, in a charitable organization, finance is an enabler for the delivery of the mission. The mission is why people are there, the employees, invariably the trustees, and invariably volunteers. And so one of the things that I've learned, I think, is that you need to understand the motivations of individuals. And if you understand that, you're able to influence more effectively on something that you might feel strongly about. But also listen, because you'll have a board member that is incredibly passionate about something, but they'll have real insights. They'll have lived experiences. And I think listening to that and challenging, I've listened and challenged myself and come to a different conclusion about something. So being on a charity board is very different, but I think boards play a really important role in the charitable sector for a couple of reasons, really. One is obviously you need good governance and there's the Charities Commission and the like. But actually, in an environment where there is less finance around, that pivot around how you do things differently can be a real challenge for the organization. And I think that's where having a strong board and having a good chair is particularly important. And again, if I use the example of the Children's Society, an amazing chair, Janet Legrand at the time, and Matthew Reed was the CEO. And the Children's Society made that really clear decision to move more to the advocacy space rather than direct delivery. But that was a journey that we needed to go on to persuade people as to why that was the right thing. It is very much about winning hearts and minds. So it absolutely was the right thing to do. It made more sense. And actually, looking back on it, that the impact that organisation has is quite considerable. And I think punches way above its weight in terms of the advocacy space and moves into areas that are quite difficult. They tackle some really tricky areas that impact young people.
Winning hearts and minds is a recurring challenge I hear board members in pro bono roles facing. I think I'm learning about what that takes as a CEO to do. I think I've struggled in the past as a board member to know how to really help in that situation. If you've got a good CEO, it's easy. They know what to do. If you haven't got a good CEO, it sometimes feels like you're pushing on a string. And the only option you have is to work out whether the cost of them not being able to do this well is so high that you need to replace them. How do you as a board member contribute to that process?
You're right about the importance of the right CEO. And I think it's about creating the right environment so you've got trust, but also so that you can challenge and provide some insights. And sometimes it's about mentoring and coaching. And one of the things that I think I've learned from sitting on charity boards and boards generally is that as much happens outside of a boardroom meeting as inside a boardroom meeting. And I think if you've got resistance, one of the ways to work with that resistance, first and foremost, you've got to be joined up as a board. And then the second is how you get the different stakeholders on board. And I think that is about conversation and understanding their point of view, but also providing that challenge in a safe space. I have been on boards where, certainly in the charitable space, where I felt that the pace, and not just myself, but some of the board felt the pace and the approach around digital adoption was slower than we probably would have thought was right for the organisation. But there was quite an entrenched CEO and some of the board who were very much about the legacy model. And you can work with that for a period of time, but you may not be able to shift it. And I think if you can't shift it, that's a decision that you as a board member need to make. What I would say is that in all of that, I would also be listening to why they felt they couldn't shift it. And sometimes it's about the impact now rather than growth and reach, which is what we used to in the commercial environment. So I think sometimes we have to challenge ourselves if we're from the commercial sector and we go on those charitable boards in terms of what are our measurements of success versus what might be their measurements of success.
That's interesting. That pace of digital transformation, again, is a recurring theme I hear across lots of boards right now. How did you in the first place get yourself confident that the pace was not great enough?
I think for me, and the example that I'm giving, it was more about could we have greater reach and impact? And the other challenge would be, could I see others doing this more easily and coming into that space by developing something that was more digitally savvy and could reach that audience? And maybe I'm burnt from my years of working in the music industry where transformation happened and it happened at quite a pace and the formats of the sector changed really radically. And it was a new entrant that changed the level playing field and how music is now consumed and how companies relate to. It's a direct to consumer model. It's a more direct relationship. That happened really quickly. And I think organizations weren't prepared. And maybe that experience has stayed with me whenever I'm thinking about digital is where can that change come from? Where will that change come from? And maybe that's the challenge that I offer or I bring to a boardroom table around digital. And it's touching many organizations right now, of course.
That looking at what others are doing and saying, hey, they're doing that over there, why can't we do that? That echoes something actually I picked up from another guest, Matthew Newcomb-Ellis, in episode 48, where he was looking at different health charities and saying, well, hang on, there are that many sufferers of that disease in their charity and they have this much revenue. Whereas in the space we're in, we've got the same number of sufferers and we're not raising as much funds. That doesn't make sense, which always struck me as a very powerful way of thinking about it. It sounds like that's what you're doing with that digital transformation.
Yeah.
You're finding comparable benchmarks that you can hold up to the management and say, we'll explain why there's this gap.
Yeah. I think also, you've just touched on something else there, which is about the need to collaborate to drive change in an industry or in a sector. And certainly there's lots of conversation, isn't it, at the moment around sustainability and net zero and transition plans. But actually, sectors or industries are only ever going to transition fully by working together. There's a limited amount of funds, and actually by those funds being pooled or being deployed around particular focus areas, you're likely to have a much greater impact.
If we just stay with that digital transformation challenge for a second, so you have convinced yourself as a board member that there is a gap to where you should be and where you are. You've got the rest of the board with you, but you still have an executive team who are not bought in. Where do you go from there?
I think it's about building that relationship with the exec team. I think you can invariably get exec teams on board. They're living it every day. It's their role to implement the change and help the business be sustainable. For me, it's about how do you bring them on board? How do you influence? What's the kind of relationship outside the boardroom? Who do they listen to? How do you bring the outside in? So board strategy days are a brilliant opportunity and really good chairs. Alison Fain does this really well at Sage's. Board away days and board strategy days are about bringing broader perspective into those discussions. So what else is happening in the sector? What else is happening in parallel businesses? And I think that's a way of really helping the exec. But also, I'd also go back to what I said previously, which is by being an exec and having a board role, that's also really powerful for your own development. So I would be saying to most chairs, really encourage your chief execs and your CFOs and some of your C-suite to have other board roles to kind of bring that learning and development, but also to give them the time and the space to reflect and to cover up and to bring some of those external experiences in. So I don't think it's one thing. It's a multitude of things. What I would say, and I think might be where you're going with your questioning, I do think there are occasions where you're not going to get where you need to get to with a member of the exec team, and you need to force a change then. And I'd use one example where I had a CFO that I was working with, and they kept assuring me that everything would be fine. And I knew deep down I had my concerns and my worries, and I didn't push, didn't explore. And of course, we didn't achieve what we thought we were going to achieve. And, my learning there is no amount of coaching and supporting would have changed the behavior. So it was about the behaviors. So the learning there is actually drill down and speak to a wider group, but also know when you need to influence to make the change.
You've talked about winning hearts and minds. You've talked about the challenge of digital transformation. Aside from those two, what other challenging situations have you faced as a trustee?
So as a trustee, I think when people join a charity board, invariably what they're bought into are the values and the mission and purpose of the organisation. A number of charities have gotten into difficulties over the years, like reputational issues. And certainly the Children's Society had some challenges at one point. And I think the key thing for me during that period, and probably the biggest learning, was that in dealing with a crisis and dealing with potential reputational issues, you absolutely had to do the right thing by those impacted potentially. And for me, it was that thing around really learning that you have to care, you have to do the right thing, you have to show compassion, and balancing that with an organisation and where it is now and the impact it's having and the responsibility that you have as a trustee to make sure charity continues to do the amazing work that it's doing and impacting the lives of many in a positive way. So, and I think reputation is something that all businesses grapple with. So taking it from the kind of charitable sector into the corporate world, you have challenges all the time with misinformation, with social media, with increased scrutiny. But it's making sure that you can manage reputation in a way that is fair, but also safeguarding the organisation. And I think boards, whether a charity or corporate boards, have to kind of be aware of that. And we have to be grappling with it all the time. So the challenge was not to get caught by the frenzy of reputation and the crisis, but have a really level head about what that meant for the organisation and the sustainability and the future of the organisation.
We record Enter the Boardroom in the hope it gives you ideas that can add value to your boardrooms and help unlock non-executive opportunities. If you found it helpful and want more structured board-level learning, development and networking, I'd encourage you to try New Role Plus. Our new 6-month boardroom courses provide structured guidance from senior board members and New Role's board search professionals. Across 12 different events, the course is designed to help you decide which roles to apply for, refine your board CV and profile, network strategically, prepare for chair positions, master applications, and sharpen your board interview skills. To celebrate our milestone of 100,000 Enter the Boardroom downloads, I'm delighted to offer a 10% discount to all our listeners who sign up between now and the end of March. Head to plus.newrole.com and apply the code ENTER, all lowercase, at checkout. I want to move on to talk about the transition from pro bono to paid roles, because it's something many New Role members are grappling with. And you've managed to execute that very successfully. And it looks like quite a conscious shift in where you've been concentrating your attention, because you had a long period in pro bono roles and now you've built up a broad portfolio of paid roles. Can you give me an outline of the way you've thought about that transition? Why make the transition and what's been helpful to you doing it?
I knew I wanted to make the transition. I loved being on boards and the diversity of the people that you meet, the kind of intellectual challenge. In terms of transitioning to paid, I would say there's an element of luck. I don't know that it was necessarily intentional. My first corporate role was Sage, actually, PE-backed business. And that came about because somebody recommended me to a headhunter. The key things there, and probably why I was successful, was that it was a commercial organisation. And obviously my background is predominantly commercial. It was a values-driven business in terms of meeting a particular need. And I guess the comparison was I was at Pearson and Sage was housing. And both were highly regulated. So there were some real similarities, which meant that I could see where I might fit and where I might add value. And the key thing there was that it came via recommendation to a headhunter who I'd never known. And that would be my one piece of advice I'd give to anybody, which is it's very hard to apply for things cold. If you get a recommendation, it's much easier. So that's how the first one came about. And then subsequently, once you get the first one, then I think you kind of join that kind of community. You go to different events, you network with the headhunters, and then the other opportunities start to flow. But it's not easy. So it was interesting that you said I've transitioned very successfully. I mean, I think on reflection, over the 3 years, I probably have. But it's not been an easy transition and it takes much longer, and I'm still on that journey. So I think the first one was a bit of luck. It was about a recommendation. It's then getting to know the headhunters and then the opportunities come about. It's interesting, the UKHSA one, I was approached to apply for the chair of audit role for the Department for Education. And anybody who's done public appointments or been through public appointments processes will understand my pain here, where that process took longer than the Labour leadership election at the time. So it took over 6 months to complete and I wasn't successful. But then subsequently, I was then approached again by the public appointments team about the role with UKHSA and encouraged to apply and said, would I like to apply? And I did apply and was successful. So it's kind of getting into that network and being known. My key bit of advice would be, I'm less about what the sector is. I'm more about, can I relate to it? Can I learn? Can I add something? And who are the other board members? Who's the chair? Who's the chief exec? So those have been the kind of key drivers for me. So yeah, a bit of luck getting in there and then it kind of takes a bit of a flow, but it's by no means an easy process. And you have periods where nothing happens. And I always say that you probably have to have 30 conversations before one converts, because there's a lot that needs to align. So you're smiling.
At least
Yeah.
30.
Yeah.
That's
Although there was a
doing well.
really scary report, really good report that said that it can take 2 years to get your first corporate board role. And I think people need to know that and be realistic about it. In the same way as you don't build a career or build a business overnight, where you might build, if you're very lucky, your business might take off in a year, but in reality, it's 5 years plus. Building a portfolio career and transitioning to being a full-time NED is exactly the same. It's a career. It takes a while to build and you have to be incredibly patient. So yes, I've had a bit of luck. I've learned how to navigate the system, and hopefully as well, you leverage your experience and you leverage what you've achieved on boards or your reputation, and that helps you to kind of springboard onto the other opportunities. You have to keep those relationships fresh. They're busy. If you haven't spoken to a headhunter in a year, then you're not going to be on their list when that opportunity comes up. I think for me personally, what's worked is building authentic relationships, knowing where I'm comfortable and where I'm not comfortable. And I'm definitely not comfortable in the room of 300 people with a champagne glass thinking about who I'm going to pick off. And I think it's okay to say that, because there'll be others who aren't comfortable with that.
So I'm with you on that. There's nothing I hate more than that sort of scenario. And it's one of the reasons why we built the New Role Plus community. And one of the things that offers we have in that, which I really love, are these mastermind groups for non-execs, where you come together and you share a challenge that you're wrestling with and you're able to get value from the peer group. But I think one of the offshoots of that is, especially if you're more introverted, is you can be really focused on the problem, but you do get these bonds forged in fire. And so by the end of that 2-hour session, you have 8 new people who have a really good sense of what sort of value you are, who you are, and you feel connected to them. And I feel like we need more opportunities like that to help those who perhaps don't necessarily naturally lean into the characteristics that help you sort of raise your profile. Recorded a wonderful episode with Thomas Chamorro-Prevasic, who is the author of Why Do So Many Incompetent Men Become Leaders, and talked about the skills that are required to get you into the leadership positions. Confidence are very different from the skills that require you to be a good leader, competence, and why and how boards need to think more about, what are they seeing? Is it confidence or competence?
That comes with practice and it comes with sitting on different boards, but it also comes as a result of what that culture is around the board table and who the chair is. The role of the chair is so crucial in terms of creating that environment and the working of the chair and the CEO. And I think the ability to bring all the voices in. I mean, we've heard a lot about that on the podcast, which is, again, I'll use Sage as an example, but we had a brilliant board member, Gareth Llewellyn, who wouldn't say very much, but whenever he asked a question, it was incredibly insightful and got not just the board and the exec thinking slightly differently about a particular issue. It was invariably relevant. So I think creating that environment where you pull out those voices is really important. And confidence, I think, as with most things, comes with practice. And some people are better at it than others. And I've talked earlier about examples where I might have tackled a situation slightly differently, or I'm more confident, but actually that confidence has come with doing board roles for a number of years. And so faced with that same situation, I probably would approach it differently.
You did a brilliant job earlier talking through some of the challenges you faced in pro bono board positions. Be interested to hear, are there challenging situations you faced as a paid board member that those listening might find instructive?
I guess the most challenging situation as a paid board member was probably I was on the board of Hipgnosis Songs Fund, which was a whirlwind, a fantastic opportunity, but also incredibly challenging. We were under huge amounts of scrutiny from the media, I think disproportionate, but also from shareholders to return value. It was a newly constituted board. I'll kind of share more the learnings and my reflections on that from a governance standpoint. I think first and foremost, the importance of a good chair, and we had an amazing chair there, Rob Naylor, but also having a board. It was a small board, which I think also helped, but very quickly having to trust each other and also really rely on the different skill set around that table. So it was music IP business that was a fund. So having the experience of people with deep financial services experience was really important. But then having music experience was also really important. So Francis Keeling and I were the two who had the music experience. And I think the board at different points being able to lean into each other to leverage those experiences to get to the right outcome was really crucial. I mean, one example would be in deciding who we chose as our advisors, particularly around valuation. By having the music insight, we were able to probe a bit more and make sure we got the right outcome there. And then the other thing I'd say is that a boardroom is not all about agreeing all of the time. So that was the other thing, is that we didn't agree all of the time. There was a real challenge, and actually sometimes it was quite robust between a couple of us. But that challenge and that not agreeing was really important to work through what the right outcome was going to be. When I joined the board of Hipgnosis, I thought it was going to be for 9 years. It was for a year. But I probably got 9 years worth of experience in a year. So I would also add that a really good chair, really good board with really diverse skill set and the right skill sets, high level of trust and challenge and respect for each other, really good advisors. And at the end of that, I think I'm really proud of what we achieved in terms of the outcomes, in terms of returning shareholder value. So that would be my example of the most challenging. And often I catch up with Rob and Francis, and we always say, we don't think we'll ever experience anything like that again. And I don't think we will. Probably a second challenge, I'd probably pick the UK Health Security Agency. And this is more for people thinking about sitting on different types of boards. So a public sector board is very different from a commercial board, is very different from a charitable board in terms of pace, in terms of motivations, in terms of process and governance. So for UK Health Security there's a lot more governance and process in that organisation, as you would expect, because it's a public body and ultimately the responsibility is to the public. And so the challenge for me was really learning how to navigate that in helping to get to the right outcomes. And I joined a really challenging situation in that we'd had 2 years of disclaimed accounts and we moved to limited assurance. So really building those relationships and influencing the exec team around bringing in advisors to help them get to where they needed to get to, but also the relationship with the National Audit Office, the relationship with the Department of Health and Social Care, really working through that and building that and working in a slightly different way and recognizing that the pace and the decision making is not going to be the same as, say, on a commercial board that I'm on, like somewhere like Sage, where if I have a question, I might pick the phone up to the CFO or the CEO and they'll come back to me quite quickly. So it's very different, and that was challenging for me. What's helped there is the chair there, Ian Peters, is amazing. He's very seasoned at working with government, in government, and having that expertise around that board table, but then recognizing that we need the commercial bit as well to provide the challenge is also important. So how we bring in digital and AI and what's happening with risk and risk appetite is also as important. But the context of driving all of that in a public sector organisation is very different to a commercial. I know you interviewed Nadeem Zahawi and he talked about risk, didn't he? And the way the public sector operates, and it is risk averse. People are more frightened of failure there. Failure is not seen as a way of learning. And of course, in organisations, you create incubators or you create safe spaces to learn fast and fail, but be able to move a strategy on. And I think there's still a way to go there from what I can see from my limited experience in the public sector.
There's something else you touched on earlier, which was the robust nature of the discussions that you had at Hipgnosis. And it picked up something that Professor Shekshnier talked about, where he said you don't want boards disagreeing and to have what I guess Patrick Lencioni would call positive disagreement. And he said the mindset needs to shift at boards to be more about building on one another's ideas. Can you bring to life to me that why was there that constructive disagreement and why did it work well?
Yeah, I mean, you can have constructive disagreement, but you must always have consensus at the end of that. So I would agree with that view that you need to be joined up as a board. You absolutely have to be joined up as a board, because if you're not particularly helpful to the exec. But I think that the challenge we had was, and actually it was heart and head actually, probably was what our discussion ultimately was about, because it was the passion for what the business was doing, what the options were around how you continue to do it versus the alternatives of what might be right at that point in time around shareholder returns. So it was just working through that. I mean, we didn't kind of like jump at each other across the table or anything like that, but it was really good challenge. And I think I remember us having quite a long discussion about the longevity of catalogue in music. So it was bringing our different insights, but also, I guess, the kind of passion for the content and for the business to really think about what the options might be and where we should be challenging ourselves and not be seduced by it being music, basically.
Professor Shakespeare talked about the importance for a board of making the assumptions they're all bringing to the table explicit. How did you go about unpicking it? Sounds like there were perhaps differences in the timelines people were assuming were relevant in some of those conversations. Were there particular methods you used as a board to unpick those?
Yeah, absolutely. We were scientific. I mean, and that's why we ended up with the outcome that we did and the recommendation that we did that was ultimately accepted by shareholders. But actually, the role of a valuer is really important there, and having the right valuation company that understood the assets really helped us with that whole process. And I guess it's clear and it's data and it's factual. And I also think for me personally, it was drawing on my own experiences of working in music and the A&R model and what I saw and experienced in terms of how catalogue and portfolios behaved. So it was bringing that, but also really relying on the advisors. And that's why earlier earlier in the conversation, I was talking about the importance of having the right advisors to give you the kind of information and the data points or the expertise to help you as a board make the right decisions where you might not have all the facts, but also you may not necessarily be aligned. And you're not always going to be aligned to start with, because invariably around a boardroom table, you've got different people with different experiences, different insights. And some of that is about how you tease some of that out, but in a constructive way. And one of the things that I would say for definite with the hypnosis experience is that there was consensus across the board about how we move forward. But we created an environment, or there was an environment created where we were able to kind of test and bring some alternative challenge to the journey that we were on.
As you mentioned earlier, that was a very high profile situation in the media, and I imagine it was hugely intense in terms of work. Curious to hear how that experience was for you and how you think about that in your portfolio now, having gone through that experience.
Yeah, I'm smiling because you can't anticipate what's going to happen, would be the first thing that I would say. And actually, during that period, we were probably as a board working every day of the week on the business. And the reflections are, people always talk about bandwidth and making sure you've got bandwidth and you've got space. I think in the current environment where there is so much complexity around boards, there's so much scrutiny, there's reputational challenges, I think it's always being aware that you may be pulled in more. And whilst we're meant to be at the helicopter level, and yeah, we need to kind of do the sniffing and know where the issues are, you might be more dragged into kind of working in quite a lot of detail to solve a crisis or a situation that an organisation finds itself in. And actually, it wasn't just Hipgnosis that was busy at that time. The UK Health Security Agency was busy because we had the 2 years of disclaimed accounts moving to limited. So creating the bandwidth is really important, making sure that you're not overboarded. And the other thing is, if you take on new board roles, don't take on 2 or 3 at the same time, because if you're taking on 2 or 3 at the same time, you're trying to get up to speed with those organizations. And it probably takes a year before you're completely up to speed. It's very difficult to be dragged, although hypnosis is obviously not a good example because it was less than a year that I was there. And what I meant was that if you had 2 or 3 that were new, and then you had 1 or 2 that were in crisis or requiring more of your time, so it mightn't even be in crisis, it might be a transaction, they require more of your time, you are unable to really do that. So it's about being really disciplined. You join boards and you are responsible as a collective. You've kind of got those fiduciary duties. And there are times when you will be pulled in, and just be prepared for that. I think I was sharing with you earlier that at one point last year, I think I was speaking to some of the advisors, like it felt like on a hourly basis. But there was one particular Sunday where I was chatting to one of the advisors in the US, and it was literally almost every hour. And I think at about 10 o'clock at night, I was on the call with him again. I got off the call and my daughter said, "Mum, do you need to speak to Dave?" every hour of the day, even on a Sunday. But the reality was that was where I was at that point. And yes, we absolutely needed to do that. And we were all doing that. I mean, Francis and Rob were also working flat out during that period.
So indeed, time has flown, which means it's time for the lightning round, where I'm going to say a quick question and ask you for a quick response if you're ready.
Okay, I shall try and be quick.
Best book every board member should read and why?
I'm going to pick two. I hope that's okay. So the first one is Our Iceberg is Melting by John Cotter. And why we've spoken a lot about people today and about change. And this book is fantastic for understanding the different personalities around organization, board tables, stakeholders, and how you bring them on that journey. So my favorite character in that was there's a no-no, so I don't need to say anything else. And the second, and I think I should be on commission rights for this one, is a book called What on Earth Can Go Wrong by Richard Fenning. And it was recommended to me by Kathy. I absolutely love this book. I couldn't put it down. But in terms of what's happening in the world around us at the moment and the external context of geopolitical changes, looking at risk. I mean, it's about risk and what mightn't happen and how you might anticipate it. But I think everybody should read that book. So, and I've given lots of copies to people.
Boardroom behaviour that irritates you most?
I think it's grandstanding. It's where you have a board member that feels the need to, I guess, sometimes tell other board members what is obvious, when actually it's about respecting the breadth of experience around the table.
Most valuable board ritual?
Oh, definitely what we do at Sage under Alison's guidance, which is the pre-board meetings. So having that safe space to really explore, but also spending time with the CEO, I think is really important. Can I add one other, which is people always say you can't get all of the experience around a board table. And of course you can't. But one of the things that they did at the Children's Society that I loved was that they had young people on the board. And even if you can't bring different insights into the board, think about how you can bring them in as co-opted members. So that was something that I think where businesses are thinking about how to engage with customers and a younger audience, it might not be a board role, but it might be a co-opted role.
Favourite quote?
Favourite quote. So, sorry, I've got two. So the first one is, and it's not meant to be negative, but it's a Mandela quote that says, "Fools multiply when wise men stay silent." And the other one, which I know lots of people have probably used, which is versions of Warren Buffett's, which is about reputation, where it takes 20 years to build a reputation, but you can lose it like that.
Most significant professional insight?
I think as well as building the relationship with the rest of the board, I think the best insight has been about going out and meeting customers and meeting employees and meeting stakeholders. And actually, if I give the example of Hipgnosis, I would say as a board, make sure that as a chair, the AGM isn't the only time that you're speaking to investors and shareholders. Do a check. Don't get into the space of what the chief exec is doing or the chief investment officer, but make sure you know how your customers are feeling.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
The importance of diversity around the board table. And I know there's a bit of a backlash on this, but for me, it's about the right skills, the right expertise, and looking at it, yes, through the lens of gender and race and disability, but not forgetting age and who your customers are now and who your customers are likely to be. I feel really strongly about the engagement of young people, either on boards or on subcommittees or in through reference groups.
When was the last time you got a significant judgment call wrong in the boardroom, and what did you learn?
I think probably the example I gave of a CFO telling me it was all going to be okay, and then it wasn't. And I guess the learning there was to be more confident and to really follow my instinct about where I think something isn't right and just ask the questions and triangulate that with the rest of the board, but also with delving down into the organisation.
How are you better today as a board member than when you started?
I know this is quickfire, but a private equity board is different from a government board, is different from a charitable board. So I'm hoping that I've learned is that you have to flex your style and recognise that and be patient.
And finally, 3 things our listeners should take away from this episode if they take nothing else.
So new NEDs, building a NED career takes time. It's a marathon. It doesn't happen overnight. So remember that I said 20, you said 50 conversations. So be patient and be resilient. And then the other is, and we talked a bit about this in the context of how you bring the outside into the boardroom, is the importance of staying up to date and staying relevant. And so some of that networking with peer groups and with other NEDs in other organisations is really important for keeping you relevant and up to date as well. So I think those would be the kind of two that I would pick out.
Cindy, thank you so much for taking the time to share your experience and wisdom.
Thank you, Ollie. Thanks for having me. It's been good. It's flown by as well.